She was just 6, begging outside a luxury restaurant for leftover bread to save her dying brother, until a billionaire stepped outside and everything changed. The rain poured down in cold, relentless sheets, turning the sidewalks of downtown Chicago into rivers. Beneath the glowing gold letters of the upscale restaurant Maison Delise, a small barefoot girl stood still, soaked to the bone. Her tattered dress clung to her frail body, and her tangled hair dripped water down her cheeks. But she wasn't crying. Her name was Lavinia, 6 years old, with wide gray eyes far too knowing for her age. In her arms, she clutched a limp stuffed elephant, its ear half torn, the stitching unraveling. Lavinia wasn't there for pity. She wasn't asking for money or begging for attention. She stood there watching the servers through the glass, carrying half-eaten plates to the back exit where food was scraped into bins. Her small stomach ached, but she didn't think about herself. Every beat of her heart echoed the same desperate thought. Trayan needs to eat, or he won't make it through the night. Her brother Trayan was only 8, and lay curled up inside the broken-down van they had been sleeping in for the past 3 weeks. He was burning with fever. His breath came in shallow gasps, and Lavinia knew, with a child's blunt clarity, that hunger was killing him faster than the cold. The restaurant door opened, and a tall man in an expensive navy overcoat stepped out. His leather shoes hit the pavement with purpose. Lavinia hesitated for only a second, then stepped forward into his path. "Excuse me, sir," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the rain. "Do you have any bread or anything left from dinner?" "Not for me. For my brother." The man stopped. His face was angular and handsome, with sharp cheekbones and steely green eyes. His tailored suit clung to his frame beneath the coat, and his cufflinks glittered in the light. This was Anisham Harlow, billionaire CEO of Harlow Enterprises, known across the country for his ruthless business acumen and his complete emotional detachment. Newspapers called him the machine in a man's skin. He looked down at the soaked child in front of him, his brows furrowing. Not in annoyance, not in contempt, but in something else. A flicker of recognition. A memory, maybe. A moment of silence passed between them. Then, without a word, he turned his back and walked away. Lavinia didn't cry. She just clutched the elephant tighter. A waitress by the door whispered, with a shake of her head, "Cold-hearted as they come." 3 minutes later, the man returned. He was holding a large paper bag steaming with heat. Without meeting her eyes, he held it out. "Take this. Show me where your brother is." Anisham followed the little girl down a side alley slick with rain, each step echoing off the cold brick walls. She walked with urgency, barefoot on the wet pavement. But there was no trace of fear in her steps, only determination. The billionaire, whose name was whispered with reverence and caution in boardrooms, now found himself trailing behind a child through darkness and trash-strewn puddles. Something about the way she carried herself. It unsettled him. She wasn't begging for herself. That was the first thing he noticed. The alley opened into a narrow lot where an old, rusted van sat under a flickering streetlight. Its windows were fogged, the back doors sealed with duct tape, and one of the tires sagged flat. Lavinia ran ahead, climbed into the van, then turned back toward Anisham. "He's in here," she said, lifting the door with both hands. "Please be quiet. He's sleeping, but not really sleeping." Anisham stepped inside, stooping to fit under the low roof. The warmth of the paper bag fogged his glasses, but even through the blur, he could see the boy, Trayan, curled on a heap of blankets and worn jackets. His lips were pale, his breathing shallow, his eyes closed but twitching under the lids. The boy was thin to the point of fragility, bones visible under sallow skin. A violent cough shook his body, though he didn't fully wake. "Has he eaten today?" Anisham asked, setting the bag gently down. Lavinia shook her head. "We had some crackers yesterday. I saved mine for him. He was colder today. I think he's sick inside." Her voice cracked on the last word, but she swallowed the tears. She crouched beside her brother, pulling the stuffed elephant from her arm and tucking it under Trayan's chin. Then, with mechanical routine, she opened the food bag and placed a sandwich near his mouth, like she'd done before with other scraps, hoping he might wake up to eat. He didn't stir. Anisham crouched beside her now, silent. Something twisted in his chest, a sensation unfamiliar, unwelcome. Pity was too small a word. This wasn't charity, this was witnessing. "You can't stay here," he muttered. "This boy needs a hospital." We can't go, Lavinia said, alarmed. If someone takes us, they'll separate us. We don't have papers, we don't have parents, just each other. The billionaire's mind raced. He had built empires, negotiated billion-dollar deals, dismantled rivals with cold precision. But this child begging to remain invisible, to protect a dying brother, was something he had no script for. You won't be separated, he said quietly. Not if I take you. I have doctors. You'll be safe. Lavinia blinked, cautious. Ma, why are you helping us? Anisham didn't answer immediately. He reached down, pulling his coat off his shoulders and wrapping it around the boy. Because no one helped me when I needed it, he finally said. And I remember what it feels like to be cold. And alone. She stared at him, unsure whether to believe. In that moment, under the dim light of a broken street lamp, something shifted. Not just in the van, but in Anisham himself. The machine had paused, and something human began to wake. The ambulance lights painted red and white flashes across the alleyway, bouncing off the wet concrete like silent sirens of urgency. Lavinia sat in the front seat beside the paramedic, her tiny fingers clutching the soaked hem of Anisham's coat, which still hung from her small shoulders. Her eyes were fixed on the back of the vehicle where Trayan lay strapped to a gurney, an oxygen mask pressed to his pale face, IV tubes trailing from his arm. He hadn't spoken since the van, not a word, not a sound. Anisham sat in silence beside her, his phone buzzing in his pocket. Calls from assistants, board members, lawyers, all wondering where he had vanished during one of the most high-profile restaurant openings of the year. He ignored them all. The hospital they were heading to wasn't just any hospital. It was a private medical center, owned in part by one of Anisham's holding companies. It was sleek, sterile, and expensive, a place built for people who had options. Tonight, it would be the place where a little boy with no options would be pulled back from the edge. Inside the emergency wing, the moment the staff recognized Anisham Harlow, everything moved faster. Nurses appeared, doctors responded instantly, and Trayan was wheeled into a brightly lit trauma room. Severe malnutrition, hypothermia, likely pneumonia, one of the doctors muttered. Lavinia tried to follow, but a nurse gently held her back. Sweetheart, let them work. They'll help your brother. Her lip trembled, but she nodded. I want a full team on this, Anisham said sharply. Round-the-clock care. He's to be treated like family. The doctor paused. Sir, the boy has a high-grade fever and a very weak immune response. We're starting antibiotics, but we'll need to see if he responds within the next 24 hours. What are his chances? Anisham asked. The doctor looked him in the eye. It depends how long he's been like this, but it's serious. Lavinia stood near the corner, silent and still. The lights were too bright, the walls too clean. The air smelled like bleach and urgency. She didn't belong here, but neither did her brother in that bed. Anisham noticed the tremble in her hands. Without thinking, he knelt beside her. I'll stay, he said. You don't have to be alone. She looked up at him, her gray eyes wide. But why do you care? You don't even know us. There was a long pause before he spoke. You're right, I don't know you. But I know what it's like to need someone. I know what it's like when nobody shows up. The child didn't reply, but after a few seconds, she leaned her head against his shoulder. Not because she trusted him, but because she had no one else. For the next 8 hours, Anisham Harlow, once dubbed the coldest man in corporate America, sat beside a sleeping child in a hospital waiting room, listening to the quiet beeping of machines through the wall. And for the first time in years, he hoped, not for a deal, not for profit, for a boy's life. The next morning brought a pale blue sky and the scent of rain still lingering in the air. Inside the hospital room, the atmosphere was hushed but tense. Machines clicked and beeped in measured rhythm beside Trayan's bed. His fever hadn't broken yet, but his breathing had stabilized, slightly slower, a bit less ragged. The antibiotics were beginning to work. Still, his condition remained fragile. He was unconscious, but no longer teetering at death's door. Lavinia sat curled in a chair by the window, legs tucked under her, eyes heavy from exhaustion. She hadn't cried once, not even through the night. Anisham had noticed that, how she held herself together like a soldier on a mission. Too young to carry such a burden, yet somehow carrying it better than most adults he knew. He entered the room carrying 2 cups, one with coffee, the other with hot chocolate. The latter he placed gently on the table beside her. Lavinia glanced up at him. I don't like coffee, she said softly. I figured, he replied, sitting across from her. It's for me. This one's for you." She took the cup without a smile but held it with both hands. The warmth seemed to soothe her fingers. "Is he going to die?" she asked suddenly, her voice blunt and stripped of drama. Anisham leaned forward. "The doctors say he's stronger than they expected. He's fighting, but he needs rest and food and safety." Lavinia nodded but said nothing. She sipped the drink in silence. A nurse entered quietly and handed Anisham a clipboard. "Discharge forms for temporary guardianship," she explained. "We'll need someone legally responsible if the boy remains in long-term care." Anisham took the clipboard without hesitation. "You're staying with us?" Lavinia asked, this time her voice uncertain. "If you'll let me," he said, "just until he's better." Lavinia stared at him for a long moment. People say things like that and then disappear. "I won't," Anisham said, and he meant it more deeply than he could explain. Later that day, a pediatric specialist entered the room, a young woman with short red hair and a no-nonsense demeanor. Her name was Dr. Mariel Dawes, and she'd worked in orphan care centers before joining private practice. "Sir," she said to Anisham after checking Trayan's vitals, "the boy has signs of long-term neglect. Old fractures, malnourishment, chronic infection. This didn't start last week. He's been surviving for a long time under impossible conditions." Anisham's jaw tightened. "How long will recovery take?" "Physically, a month, maybe 2. Psychologically?" She glanced at Lavinia. "That's harder to say." Lavinia pretended not to hear, but she caught every word. She had heard doctors speak that way before, in foster homes, shelters, emergency rooms, as if she and her brother were problems to solve, case files with deadlines. That night, Trayan stirred for the first time. His eyes fluttered open and his lips moved. "Vinny?" he croaked. Lavinia rushed to his side, gripping his hand. "I'm here! I'm here!" He tried to smile but winced from the pain. Anisham stood a few feet away, watching quietly. Something burned in his chest. Something that felt dangerously close to emotion. He didn't just feel responsible anymore, he felt invested. He knew in that moment he couldn't walk away from them, not even if he tried. It had been 5 days since Trayan was admitted to the hospital, and every hour brought small, hopeful improvements. His fever had broken on the 3rd night, and although his voice was still weak, he was awake more often, responding to Lavinia's quiet stories and the warm food nurses brought to his bedside. His body remained frail, but his eyes had begun to shine again. Lavinia never left the room. She sat beside him, read to him, combed his hair with her fingers, and even tried to make him laugh with soft impressions of the cartoons they used to watch together on an old phone before the battery died for good. Her entire being was focused on keeping him alive, on reminding him that he wasn't alone. Anisham came every day, dressed less and less like a billionaire, and more like a man who belonged in this place. His suits had been replaced by soft sweaters and dark jeans. He brought books, puzzles, and warm food, not only for Trayan but for Lavinia as well, though she often refused to eat unless her brother did. But something more than a routine was forming between them. Something unspoken, a bond. Not forced, not pretended, but growing steadily with each moment of shared silence, each nod, each act of quiet care. One evening after Trayan had fallen asleep and the room was dimly lit, Lavinia finally asked the question that had been heavy on her chest. "Were you really alone too, like us?" Anisham, who had been staring out the window at the glowing city skyline, turned toward her. He walked over and sat near her on the couch. "I was," he said, his voice low. "I was 9 when my mother died. We didn't have a home. Sometimes we slept in stairwells or laundromats. Sometimes people gave me food, but mostly they looked through me like I didn't exist." Lavinia looked at him with a strange mix of empathy and disbelief. "But you're rich now. You have everything." "I have things," he said. "But I didn't have anyone, not for a long time." She thought about that, then whispered, "Did it make you angry?" A pause. "Yes," he said. "It made me so angry, I stopped feeling anything at all. I worked, I fought, I climbed, but I forgot what it was like to be human." Lavinia was quiet. Then she asked, "So, are you still angry now?" He looked into her eyes, gray like cold ashes, but warm now with presence, and replied, "Not since I met you two." The door creaked open and Dr. Mariel Dawes stepped in. She smiled gently, her tone more relaxed than before. "Good news," she said. "Trayan's lungs are responding well. If he keeps improving, he could be discharged in 10 days. But he'll need rest, nourishment, and supervision. That means someone will have to take full responsibility for his care. Anisham stood up. I'll take them home with me. The doctor raised an eyebrow. You understand what that involves? I do, he replied calmly. I'm not offering charity. I'm offering a home. Lavinia stared at him, frozen. You mean we'd live with you? If you want, he said. Tears welled in her eyes, and for the first time, she didn't fight them. She turned to her brother, sleeping peacefully for the first time in weeks, and whispered, We're going to be safe now. And though the room remained quiet, it was no longer filled with silence. It was filled with something fragile and powerful. Hope. The day they were supposed to leave the hospital began with sunlight streaking through the wide windows, painting warm golden lines across the tile floor. Trayan, still thin but visibly stronger, sat up in bed playing with a deck of animal flashcards Anisham had brought him. Lavinia was packing their few belongings, a worn-out backpack, the stuffed elephant, a sweater that had once belonged to their mother. There was a knock on the hospital room door. It opened before anyone could answer. A woman in a gray blazer stepped inside, holding a clipboard and wearing a polite but guarded expression. Mr. Harlow, she asked, addressing Anisham. I'm Casey Arland, with the Department of Child Welfare. I was contacted by the hospital regarding the children. Lavinia's body instantly went still. Her arms instinctively wrapped around the backpack. Trayan dropped his cards, his fragile peace shattered. I thought everything was settled, Anisham said sharply, stepping forward. Legally, no, Casey replied. The children are minors, unaccompanied, with no documented guardians. We need to conduct a full background assessment, including interviews. They can't be released into private custody without review. They're not going into the system, he said firmly. They've been through enough. I understand, she said, her voice softening slightly, but it's not that simple. We need to ensure their safety. They're safer with him than they've ever been, Lavinia blurted out. You'll take us away and put us in one of those houses again. Casey looked at her, startled. Have you been in the system before? Lavinia looked down. 3 times. Once in St. Louis, once in Denver, once in Omaha. They separated us. One time a boy hit Trayan and no one cared. Her voice broke, and Trayan reached for her hand. They were trembling, but neither child cried. They were used to being unheard. Casey's professional demeanor cracked just a little. Anisham stepped forward. I'm filing for full guardianship. I have the legal resources and the means. If necessary, I'll bring federal attorneys into this. And what's your connection to the children, Mr. Harlow? He paused, then said something that surprised even himself. I'm their family now. The room went quiet. Casey blinked. Do you understand what that means? Yes, he said. It means being there. Always. No matter how hard. And I'm not going anywhere. She studied him for a long moment, then turned back to the children. I'll file an emergency report. But if you truly want to keep them, you'll need to follow through. Interviews, background checks, home visits. Done, he said. We'll start today. Later that afternoon, when Casey left with her forms and promises to return, Lavinia turned to Anisham. Are we still going with you? Of course you are, she nodded. Even if they say no later? He looked her in the eyes. They won't. Because I'll make sure of it. And as they exited the hospital together, Anisham pushing Trayan in a wheelchair, Lavinia holding tightly to both of them. The sun shone directly on them, as if lighting the path ahead. Not every battle had been won yet. But the children weren't alone anymore, and neither was he. The ride to Anisham's estate was silent at first. Lavinia sat in the back beside Trayan, who leaned against her shoulder, bundled in a soft new coat. She watched the world blur past the tinted windows, skyscrapers gave way to tree-lined roads, and traffic noise was slowly replaced by the hush of open space. Anisham sat in the front seat beside the driver, glancing back every few minutes, but never saying too much. He didn't want to overwhelm them. He just wanted them to know he was still there. When the car turned through tall iron gates and wound up a long, curved driveway, Lavinia's jaw tightened. She stared at the towering modern house that stood ahead. Glass walls, stone columns, a waterfall flowing into a reflecting pool. It looked like something from a movie. Impossibly clean. Impossibly far from the world she came from. You live here? Trayan whispered. For now, Anisham replied, stepping out of the car. But it's going to be yours too, if you want. A housekeeper and a nurse were waiting by the front entrance. They greeted the children warmly, but didn't come too close. Anisham had given strict instructions. No pressure, no noise, no crowding. The children needed safety, not spectacle. Inside, the house felt enormous, Echoing ceilings, spotless floors, large windows letting in light from every angle. Lavinia kept close to Trajan, holding his hand as they were shown to a separate wing. Two connected bedrooms with soft blue walls, cozy beds, shelves already filled with books and toys. "Ah, there's even a TV," Trajan said in awe, pointing to the small screen mounted on the wall. "You'll have tutors here," Anisham explained gently, "and doctors to check in on Trajan. But no one will force you to do anything. You get to rest first, heal, breathe." He left them for a while so they could explore at their own pace. Later that evening, Lavinia found him in the library. The room was dim, the air filled with the quiet scent of old leather and cedarwood. Anisham was reading a file, likely one of the dozen reports Casey Arland had sent over. She stepped in, barefoot and quiet. "This place is too big," she said. Anisham set the file down. "I used to think that too." She walked closer. Why do you live alone?" "I used to think that was safer." "For you or for them?" she asked. He smiled a little at that. "Both, maybe." Lavinia nodded, thoughtful. Then she asked something unexpected. "Do you miss your mom?" His eyes flickered. "Yes, every day. Even though I barely remember her voice." "I miss mine too, but I remember her hands. She always had red nail polish, even when we had no money." Anisham was silent for a long moment. "You don't talk like a 6-year-old, he said softly. "I haven't had time to be one," she replied. Her voice cracked on that last word. He stood, knelt beside her, and said something he hadn't said to anyone in decades. "You're safe here, Lavinia. Really safe. And I'm not going to let anyone hurt you again." She nodded slowly, then, just for a moment, stepped forward and hugged him. It was stiff, awkward, but it was real. And it was the first time Anisham Harlow had been hugged in over 20 years. Spring arrived gently, brushing the city with the smell of blooming magnolias and fresh-cut grass. At the Harlow estate, it brought change that was more than seasonal. It was human, deeply felt. It had been 3 months since Lavinia and Trajan arrived. 3 months since the silence in Anisham's house was replaced with the sound of soft laughter, footsteps running down halls, the clatter of breakfast bowls, and the creak of a rocking chair in the children's reading room. Trajan had gained weight, his cheeks fuller now, his bones no longer sharp beneath his skin. He was walking again, slowly but confidently, and spent mornings with his tutor, learning numbers and stories. In the afternoons, he and Lavinia would play in the garden. She loved pretending the flower beds were ships and castles. The stuffed elephant, now freshly stitched, always joined them. Lavinia had changed too. She still carried the weight of her past, but it no longer crushed her. She smiled more, laughed without apology, and sometimes even sang when she thought no one was listening. Her nightmares came less often, and when they did, she no longer woke up alone. On the first warm evening of May, Anisham sat with them on the balcony that overlooked the gardens. The sun was setting in streaks of gold and lavender across the horizon. Trajan was curled up beside him, half asleep after a long day, while Lavinia leaned on the railing, her hair catching the last light like a flame. "I never thought rich people sat outside like this," she said. Anisham smiled. "What did you think rich people did?" "Mostly talk to computers and yell at other people in suits," she replied, grinning. "Not entirely wrong," he said with a chuckle. She turned more serious. "Do you think people can really change?" "Yes," he answered, "but not just by trying. They change when they're needed, when someone gives them a reason." "Were we your reason?" she asked quietly. He looked at her, his voice low. "You were the reason I woke up." A long silence followed, warm and full, not awkward. Then, Lavinia asked the question she had kept locked in her chest for weeks. "Are we really going to stay here forever?" Enisham reached into his coat and pulled out 2 small envelopes. He handed one to each of them. Inside were official court documents, adoption papers finalized that morning. "You're not just staying," he said. "You're mine now, my son, my daughter." Lavinia stared at the paper, then at him. "You mean it?" "I do." And for the first time, she didn't hold back. She dropped the paper, ran into his arms, and hugged him so tightly it made him exhale sharply. Trajan woke, dazed, but smiled when he saw them. "You're my dad now?" he asked. "I always was," Anisham replied. "I just didn't know it at first." The 3 of them stayed like that for a long time, wrapped in the quiet of something whole. Not blood, not obligation, but love, built from choice and courage and healed with time. The house, once silent, now breathed. And for the first time in his life, Anisham Harlow was home. In my view, the ending of this story is not just heartwarming, it's transformative. It's a reminder that true family isn't always formed by blood, but by the quiet, consistent acts of care, sacrifice, and presence. Anisham Harlow began as a man defined by power, control, and solitude. But it took two forgotten children, fragile yet fiercely loyal to each other, to awaken the part of him that had been buried for years, the part capable of tenderness, devotion, and unconditional love. What makes this ending powerful is not just that Lavinia and Trajan were rescued, but that Anisham was too. All three of them were broken in different ways, abandoned, scarred, hardened by life. Yet, in choosing each other, they created something stronger than rescue. They built a family. And in that decision, they each reclaimed something lost: safety, trust, and belonging. The story doesn't pretend the past can be erased, but it shows that even the heaviest histories can lead to new beginnings if someone is brave enough to stay.